The summer heat hung over the auction block like a suffocating blanket. Sweat trickled down Solomon's back as he stood among 20 other enslaved men and women, their bodies displayed like merchandise. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp and practiced, as he described the merchandise to potential buyers who fanned themselves in the sweltering heat. Strong back, good teeth. Duh, the auctioneer shouted, pointing at a young man next to Solomon. Start the bidding at 300. Solomon kept his eyes fixed on the ground. 6 weeks at sea from Virginia had left him gaunt and sick. The infected wound on his face had healed poorly, leaving a jagged scar from his right eye to the corner of his mouth. The overseers had beaten him twice already for his insolent gaze. They said his eyes held something dangerous, something that made white men uncomfortable. And here we have something different, the auctioneer announced, grabbing Solomon roughly by the arm and pushing him forward. Not much to look at, I grant you. Ugly as sin with that face. But he can read. D, a murmur went through the crowd. Now, before you get worried, the auctioneer continued, he was taught by his previous master for house duties only, knows his place. Start the bidding at 200. The crowd remained silent. Solomon could feel their eyes on him, examining his scarred face, his thin frame, his downcast eyes. 150 then, the auctioneer said, his voice betraying irritation. Still silence. 100. Surely worth something to someone. Finally, a voice from the back. 75. The auctioneer's face soured. Going once at 75. 100, came another voice, and Solomon finally looked up. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles stood at the edge of the crowd. Unlike the plantation owners in their fine linens, he wore a simple black suit, frayed at the cuffs. His eyes met Solomon's for a brief moment. Sold for 100 to Mr. Edwards, the auctioneer announced, already turning his attention to the next slave. That night, chained in a holding pen with the others who'd been sold, Solomon learned about his new owner from whispers passed between the enslaved. Edwards, the one with the bookshop. That's him. Strange man. Lives alone above his shop on King Street. I heard he's from Boston, not like the others. Don't matter where he's from. Master is master. An older woman who had been listening leaned towards Solomon. You watch yourself with that one, she whispered. There's talk about slaves he's bought before. They say no one ever sees them again. Solomon's stomach tightened. What happens to them? The woman shook her head. No one knows. They just disappear. The next morning, Solomon was marched through the streets of Charleston to a narrow building wedged between a tailor and a tobacconist. A weathered sign hung above the door, Edwards and Sons Booksellers. The windows were coated with a film of dust that obscured the interior. The slave trader handed Solomon's papers to Mr. Edwards, who counted out $100 with bony fingers. Remember, he can read, the trader said. If that causes any problems. It won't, Edwards replied curtly. He turned to Solomon. Follow me. The bookshop was dimly lit, shelves reaching from floor to ceiling, every inch packed with volumes. The air smelled of old paper and dust. Edwards led Solomon through a maze of bookshelves to a door at the back, which opened onto a narrow staircase. You'll sleep in the attic, Edwards said as they climbed. Your duties will include cleaning the shop, organizing inventory, and assisting customers when appropriate. I understand you can read? Yes, master, Solomon replied, his voice low. They reached the 3rd floor. Edwards unlocked a door that revealed a small, sparse attic room. A thin mattress lay in one corner. A single window, its glass cloudy with grime, provided the only light. And right, Edwards asked, studying Solomon's face. Solomon hesitated, admitting to writing was dangerous. Don't lie to me, Edwards said sharply. I know you can. Some, master, Solomon admitted. Edwards nodded. Good, very good. He gestured to the room. This is yours. There's a chamber pot in the corner. Empty it each morning in the alley behind the shop. You'll take your meals in the kitchen on the second floor. You are never to enter my private quarters without permission." Solomon nodded, keeping his eyes down. "One more thing," Edward said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small key and handed it to Solomon. "The shop has many books. You may read them when your duties are complete, but only in this room. If anyone sees you reading, there will be severe consequences. Do you understand?" Solomon stared at the key in his palm, confusion washing over him. "Yes, master." Edwards turned to leave but paused at the door. "That scar," he said. "How did you get it?" "My previous master's son, sir. He didn't like that I could read better than him." A thin smile crossed Edward's face. "Rest tonight. Your work begins tomorrow." When Edwards left, Solomon sat on the edge of the thin mattress, turning the key over in his hands. What kind of master gives a slave permission to read? And why would Edwards buy him, scarred, undernourished, when healthier slaves were available? The old woman's words echoed in his mind. "They say no one ever sees them again." Solomon moved to the window and wiped away years of grime with his palm. Below, Charleston sprawled out in the fading light. A city built on the backs of people who looked like him. Somewhere out there was freedom, the North, perhaps even Canada. But between here and there lay slave catchers, dogs, and 1,000 miles of hostile territory. For now, he was trapped. But Solomon made a promise to himself as he watched the sun set over the city. He would discover Edward's true purpose in buying him. And somehow, someday, he would be free. That night, strange sounds woke him from a fitful sleep. From somewhere below came the muffled sound of voices. Edward's and someone else, their words indistinguishable but their tone urgent. Then came another sound that made Solomon's blood run cold, a cry of pain, quickly silenced. Solomon lay perfectly still in the darkness, listening. The floorboards creaked as someone moved through the rooms below. Then silence returned, heavy and oppressive. What had happened to the slaves Edwards had bought before him? Why had they disappeared? And what fate awaited Solomon in this house of books and shadows? Morning came with the sound of a bell. Edward stood in the doorway, his face betraying no sign of the night's events. "It's time to begin your training," he said. "Come downstairs when you're ready." As Solomon followed Edwards down the narrow stairs, he noticed something he had missed the night before. Deep scratches in the wood of the banister, as if made by desperate fingernails. Days at Edward's bookshop settled into a rhythm. Solomon rose at dawn, emptied his chamber pot, and prepared a simple breakfast for himself and Edwards. Then he would sweep the shop, dust the countless books, and organize new arrivals according to Edwards's precise system. Customers were few. Occasionally, a professor from the nearby college or a lawyer from the courthouse would browse the shelves, but most days passed in near silence. Edwards spent hours in his private study on the second floor, emerging only to assist the rare customer or to give Solomon new tasks. At first, Solomon was careful to appear obedient and simple-minded, keeping his eyes down and his movements slow. But as weeks passed, he began to study Edwards carefully, watching for any clue to the man's true nature or the fate of the other slaves who had come before. Edwards was not like other masters Solomon had known. He never raised a hand to Solomon, never used the vile language so common among slaveholders. Instead, he treated Solomon with a cold, distant courtesy that was somehow more unsettling than outright cruelty. And then there were the books. True to his word, Edwards had allowed Solomon to read in the privacy of his attic room. Each night, Solomon would select a volume from the shop's vast collection, careful to choose one that wouldn't be missed, and retreat to his room to read by candlelight. He read histories, philosophies, novels, works by authors whose names he committed to memory: Rousseau, Voltaire, Paine. Books that spoke of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. Books that would be considered dangerous, even treasonous, in the hands of an enslaved person. Was this a test? Was Edwards waiting for Solomon to reveal himself, to provide justification for some punishment? Or did Edwards have some other purpose in mind? 1 month into his captivity, Solomon made a discovery. While cleaning the shop's back room, he noticed that one of the bookshelves didn't quite meet the wall. Curious, he pressed against it and felt it give slightly. Glancing over his shoulder to ensure he was alone, Solomon pushed harder. The bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. Solomon's heart raced. He knew he should close the hidden door immediately, pretend he had never found it. But curiosity, the same dangerous curiosity that had driven him to learn to read despite the risks, pushed him forward. The passage led to a small room, windowless and lit only by the faint light spilling through the open door. Solomon squinted in the dimness. The walls were lined with more shelves, but these didn't hold books. Instead, they were filled with jars, bottles, and small wooden boxes, each carefully labeled. In the center of the room stood a table. On it lay papers covered with writing and strange diagrams. Solomon moved closer, straining to read in the poor light. The papers contained notes on human anatomy, detailed drawings of the brain, and page after page of observations about subjects. With growing horror, Solomon realized that these were notes about people, enslaved people, purchased and brought to this room. "I see you've discovered my laboratory." Solomon spun around. Edward stood in the doorway, his thin frame silhouetted against the light from the bookshop. "Master, Solomon began, fear closing his throat. "No need for explanations," Edward said, stepping into the room. "I expected your curiosity would lead you here eventually. It's part of why I chose you." "Chose me?" Solomon managed, fighting the urge to back away. "Yes." Edwards moved to the table and straightened the papers. "Do you know what I study, Solomon?" Solomon shook his head. "The human mind," Edwards said. His voice took on a passionate quality Solomon had never heard before. Its capacities, its limitations, how it can be improved. "I don't understand, Master." Edwards smiled thinly. "No, I don't expect you do yet." He gestured to the shelves of bottles and jars. "These are compounds I've developed over years of research. Substances that affect the mind in various ways, enhancing memory, increasing concentration, stimulating particular emotions." Solomon's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The others, the slaves before me." "My subjects, yes," Edward said matter-of-factly. "Unfortunately, many of my earlier formulations had undesirable side effects, but I've refined my methods considerably." A cold fear gripped Solomon. "Am I to be your next subject?" Edward studied him for a long moment. "That depends on you. Solomon, you're different from the others. Your literacy, your intelligence, these make you valuable in ways beyond mere experimentation. You could be an assistant rather than a subject, if you prove yourself worthy." Solomon's mind raced. Was this an opportunity or merely a different kind of trap? Either way, it might keep him alive longer than outright refusal. "What would you have me do, Master?" Edward smiled, apparently satisfied with Solomon's response. "For now, continue as you have been. Attend to the shop, read your books. But now you will also help me with my records. Your writing skills will be useful." "And if I refuse?" The smile vanished from Edwards's face. "I would not advise that course of action." That night, Solomon lay awake on his thin mattress, turning over the day's revelations in his mind. Edwards was conducting experiments on enslaved people, experiments that had apparently resulted in their deaths, if the whispered rumors were to be believed. But why? What was he trying to achieve? And what would happen to Solomon if he refused to participate? A new sound interrupted his thoughts, a soft tapping from the wall beside his bed. Solomon froze, listening. 3 taps, then 2, then 3 again. Cautiously, Solomon tapped back 3 times. There was a pause, then a voice, barely audible through the wall. "Help me!" Solomon pressed his ear to the wall. "Who's there?" he whispered. "Sarah," came the faint reply. "Been here, don't know how long. He gives me things that make my head swim." Another subject. Solomon had assumed he was alone in the house, but Edwards must have kept this woman hidden away. "Are there others?" Solomon asked. There were, now just me. A pause. "And you? What does he want? What is he trying to do?" "Make us better, stronger, smarter." The voice grew fainter, but it hurts. It burns inside my head. "I'll help you," Solomon promised, though he had no idea how. "We'll escape." No response came. Solomon tapped again, but the wall remained silent. The next morning, Edwards was waiting for Solomon in the shop. "I have a delivery to make," he said. "You will mind the shop while I'm gone. Remember, if anyone asks, you are just sweeping up. You do not assist customers." After Edwards left, Solomon immediately began searching for the woman named Sarah. He found another hidden door behind the bookshelf in Edwards' private study, which led to a small, locked room. Through the keyhole, Solomon could see a thin woman lying on a cot, her arms secured with leather straps. "Sarah," he whispered. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, her pupils unnaturally dilated. "Who?" she murmured. "I'm Solomon. I spoke to you through the wall last night." "Solomon?" She seemed confused. "I don't remember." Before Solomon could respond, he heard the shop's bell ring, announcing a customer. Reluctantly, he returned to the main floor. A well-dressed man was browsing the shelves. When he saw Solomon, his eyebrows rose. "Where is Mr. Edwards?" the man demanded. "Making a delivery, sir," Solomon replied, keeping his eyes lowered. "He'll return shortly." The man frowned. "Tell him Dr. Whitmore called. I need to speak with him about his recent acquisitions." "Yes, sir." As the man turned to leave, Solomon noticed something fall from his coat pocket, a small leather-bound notebook. After the man left, Solomon retrieved it and quickly leafed through the pages. Inside were notes similar to Edwards', observations about experiments on enslaved people, but with a crucial difference. These notes described experiments conducted not for scientific inquiry, but for developing methods to make slaves more docile, more obedient, more productive. The final pages contained correspondence between Dr. Whitmore and several prominent plantation owners, discussing the potential profit in improving their human property through chemical means. Solomon tucked the notebook into his shirt just as the shop bell rang again. Edwards had returned. That night, Solomon read Whitmore's notebook by candlelight, horror growing with each page. This wasn't just one man's twisted experimentation. It was the beginning of something much larger, much more terrifying. A systematic attempt to further subjugate enslaved people through chemical means. He had to escape. He had to take this information north, to abolitionists who could expose these atrocities. But first, he needed to help Sarah. Through the wall, Solomon tapped their code, but received no response. Had Edwards moved her, or had something worse happened? As Solomon pondered his next move, a new sound reached him, voices from the street below. He moved to the window and saw a group of men gathered outside the bookshop. Even in the darkness, he recognized Dr. Whitmore among them. Something was happening, something that Solomon suspected would change everything. Edwards was agitated the next morning. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the shop, and his eyes darted frequently to the window. "Dr. Whitmore will be visiting this afternoon," he told Solomon. "You are to remain in your room until he leaves. Under no circumstances are you to come downstairs." "Yes, master," Solomon replied. Keeping his face carefully blank, despite the fear coiling in his stomach, did Whitmore know his notebook was missing? And what business did he have with Edwards? As Solomon went about his morning chores, he noticed Edwards preparing the hidden laboratory, cleaning the table, arranging his instruments, and setting out several bottles of colored liquids. By midday, Solomon was locked in his attic room as instructed, but rather than sitting quietly, he pressed his ear to the floor, straining to hear the conversation below. The voices were muffled, but occasionally words floated up clearly enough to understand. "Progress with the female subject?" Whitmore was asking. "Promising results?" came Edwards' reply. "Significant improvement in memory capacity, though some deterioration in basic functions. And the new one, the male with the scarred face? Not yet begun. I'm still assessing his baseline abilities." "Time is running short, Edwards. The investors expect results." "Science cannot be rushed, Doctor. This isn't about your precious science anymore. This is business." Their voices lowered again, becoming indistinguishable. Solomon sat back on his heels, mind racing. Investors, business. This went beyond Edwards's solitary experiments. There were powerful people backing this work, people who saw profit in controlling enslaved minds. The sound of footsteps on the stairs sent Solomon scrambling away from the door. A key turned in the lock, and Edwards entered, his face flushed with anger. "Change of plans," he said curtly. "You'll be joining us downstairs." Solomon followed Edwards down to the laboratory, where Dr. Whitmore waited. On the table lay Sarah, conscious but restrained, her eyes wide with fear. "Ah, the new subject," Whitmore said, examining Solomon like a horse at auction. "Edwards tells me you're quite intelligent for your kind. How fortunate for our research." Solomon remained silent, his eyes meeting Sarah's briefly. Her lips formed a single word: "Run." "Today," Edwards announced, "we will be demonstrating the effects of Compound 7 on cognitive enhancement. Solomon, you will observe and take notes on the female subject's responses." Whitmore handed Solomon a pen and paper. "Record everything exactly. Any deviation, any attempt to sabotage our work will be severely punished." Solomon took the pen, his hand steady despite his inner turmoil. He had never been this close to Sarah before. She appeared to be in her 30s, her once strong body now thin and frail from whatever experiments Edwards had already conducted on her. Edwards prepared a syringe with a clear liquid from one of his bottles. "Compound 7 has shown remarkable effects on memory retention and processing speed," he explained, swabbing Sarah's arm with alcohol. "However, the duration of effect has been inconsistent, and there have been concerning side effects in previous subjects." "What side effects?" Whitmore asked. "Seizures, paranoia, in 2 cases cerebral hemorrhage leading to death." Whitmore frowned. "That won't do for commercial application." "Hence today's adjustments to the formula," Edwards replied, inserting the needle into Sarah's arm. Solomon watched in horror as Sarah's body tensed, her back arching against the restraints. Her eyes rolled back momentarily, then focused with an unnatural intensity. "Begin the assessment," Edwards instructed. What followed was a grotesque demonstration. Edwards showed Sarah complex patterns and mathematical problems which she solved with uncanny speed. He recited long passages of text which she repeated verbatim. Her mind was clearly operating at an extraordinary level, but her body trembled continuously and blood trickled from her nose. "Remarkable," Whitmore murmured, scribbling his own notes. "How long will the effects last?" "Based on previous trials, approximately 6 hours," Edwards replied, "though this enhanced formulation may—" He was interrupted by Sarah's sudden, violent convulsion. Foam appeared at her mouth, and her eyes rolled back completely. "Damn it!" Edwards grabbed a wooden stick and forced it between her teeth. "Help me hold her down." Solomon moved forward automatically, helping to restrain Sarah's thrashing body. As he leaned close to her, she suddenly became still, her eyes focusing on his face with startling clarity. "Attic floorboard," she whispered, so softly that only Solomon could hear. "Loose map." Then her body went rigid, her back arching impossibly high. A final rattling breath escaped her lips, and she collapsed, still and silent. Edwards checked her pulse, then stepped back, his face betraying frustration rather than sorrow. Subject 12, experiment terminated at 3:42 p.m. Cause, cerebral hemorrhage, most likely. Whitmore shook his head. "This is the third failure this month, Edwards. The investors are losing patience." "The formula needs more refinement," Edwards insisted. "Perhaps if we adjust the binding agent—" "No more adjustments," Whitmore cut him off. "We move to phase 2. He turned to Solomon. "Prepare him for initial testing tomorrow morning. Let's see if a male subject responds differently to the compound." Solomon felt cold fear wash over him. Tomorrow they would inject him with the same substance that had just killed Sarah before his eyes. "Doctor," Edwards protested, "we haven't established proper baseline measurements for this subject yet. Protocol demands at least 2 weeks of—" "Protocol be damned. The Charleston Medical Society meeting is in 3 weeks. We need demonstrable results by then." Whitmore gathered his papers. "Either produce those results, Edwards, or your funding will be redirected to researchers with fewer ethical concerns." After Whitmore left, Edwards ordered Solomon to help him move Sarah's body. They carried her down to the cellar, where a trapdoor in the floor revealed a small space beneath the foundation. "The others," Solomon realized aloud, seeing several decomposing forms already laid there. Edwards nodded grimly. "Science demands sacrifice, Solomon. Remember that when it's your turn tomorrow." That night, Solomon pried up the loose floorboard Sarah had mentioned. Beneath it, he found a small oilskin package. Inside was a crudely drawn map of Charleston and the surrounding area, with a route marked in faint pencil leading north. Also included was a small brass key and a note in shaky handwriting. "Edwards safe. Bottom drawer. Study desk. Papers inside will bring him down. Take to 24 Bull Street. Ask for Thomas." Sarah must have been planning her own escape before the experiments had damaged her too severely. Now it was up to Solomon to complete her mission. He had until morning. Edwards would be expecting him to sleep, knowing the experiments would begin tomorrow. It might be the only chance he would get. Silently, Solomon crept down the attic stairs. The house was quiet, but a light shone from beneath Edward's bedroom door. He would have to wait. Hours passed. Finally, the light went out. Solomon gave it another hour before moving to Edward's study. The desk drawer was locked, but Sarah's key fit perfectly. Inside the drawer was a small safe, which the key also opened. The safe contained a leather portfolio filled with papers, research notes, letters from investors, and detailed records of experiments conducted on over 20 enslaved people, evidence of atrocities committed in the name of science and profit. Solomon also found a small purse containing several gold coins and a pistol with a single bullet. Taking the portfolio, the coins, and the pistol, Solomon crept toward the shop's back door. He had memorized Sarah's map and knew his first destination. But as he reached for the door latch, a floorboard creaked behind him. "I had such hopes for you, Solomon." Edwards stood in the doorway, a lantern in one hand and a scalpel in the other. "Not as a subject," Edwards continued, his voice sad rather than angry. "As a collaborator. You have a fine mind, too fine to waste. Do you not see the importance of this work?" Solomon gripped the pistol in his pocket. "I see men treating other men like animals, worse than animals. Progress requires sacrifice. Not my sacrifice, not Sarah's, not anymore." Solomon drew the pistol and aimed it at Edwards. Edward's eyes widened, then narrowed. You won't shoot. Where would you go? A scarred Negro with a stolen gun? You wouldn't make it a mile? I'll take my chances. Solomon edged toward the door. Think, Solomon. Join me, and your mind could reach its full potential. We stand at the threshold of a new understanding of human consciousness. At the cost of how many lives? What are a few lives compared to the advancement of knowledge? Solomon's finger tensed on the trigger. It would be so easy to end this man's monstrous experiments right now. But the sound of a gunshot would bring others, and Solomon knew his escape depended on stealth, not violence. Goodbye, Mr. Edwards, Solomon said, backing toward the door. Edwards lunged, suddenly, scalpel raised. Solomon fired the pistol reflexively. The shot was deafening in the small shop. Edwards staggered, clutching his shoulder, then collapsed to the floor. Solomon didn't wait to see if he survived. He ran into the Charleston Knight, the precious portfolio tucked under his arm, following the escape route Sarah had mapped out. The path to freedom lay ahead, but so did dangers he could scarcely imagine. Dawn was breaking as Solomon reached the address on Sarah's map, 24 Bull Street, a modest house with green shutters. He hesitated, then knocked softly on the door. A young white woman answered, her eyes widening at the sight of Solomon. Disheveled, exhausted, with a pistol visible in his waistband. I'm looking for Thomas, Solomon said quickly. Sarah sent me. The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. Come in, quickly. Inside, she led him to a small back room where a middle-aged white man sat at a desk covered with papers. He looked up sharply as they entered. This man says Sarah sent him, the woman explained. The man stood. I'm Thomas Grimke. Where is Sarah? Dead, Solomon replied bluntly. Edwards killed her with his experiments. Just like all the others. Grimke's face darkened. We feared as much when she missed her last communication. He gestured for Solomon to sit. And you are? Solomon, Edward's newest acquisition, or I was, until tonight. Solomon handed over the portfolio he had taken from Edward's safe. Grimke examined the contents, his expression growing grimmer with each page. This is it, he said finally. The evidence we've been seeking for months. Evidence of what? Solomon asked. A conspiracy larger than you can imagine, Grimke explained. For years, we've been tracking a group of doctors and plantation owners developing methods to increase slave productivity through chemical means. Edwards was just one researcher in their network. The woman, who had introduced herself as Elizabeth Grimke, Thomas's sister, brought Solomon food and fresh water. You're abolitionists, Solomon realized. Thomas nodded. Our family once owned slaves. Now we work to end the institution that stole so many lives, including our own souls. He tapped the portfolio. These papers implicate dozens of Charleston's most prominent citizens. Doctors, plantation owners, even a judge. What will you do with them? Send copies to abolitionist newspapers in the North. Expose their crimes to the world. Thomas studied Solomon. But first, we need to get you to safety. You're a witness to these atrocities, and they'll want to silence you. I can't stay in Charleston, Solomon agreed. Not after shooting Edwards. Thomas and Elizabeth exchanged glances. Shot, not killed. I don't know if he survived. I aimed for his shoulder. Thomas frowned. Then we must assume he's alive and will come looking for you. We need to move quickly. That night, disguised as a servant accompanying the Grimkes on a trip north, Solomon left Charleston by carriage. The portfolio of evidence was hidden in a false bottom of Elizabeth's trunk, with copies secreted in the carriage's upholstery. They travelled by night when possible, taking back roads and avoiding major checkpoints. Thomas had contacts throughout the South, a network of abolitionists, both black and white, who provided safe houses along their route. At each stop, Thomas made copies of Edward's papers, sending them north through different channels to ensure at least some would reach their destinations. 2 weeks into their journey, while staying at a safe house in North Carolina, Solomon awoke to urgent voices. Their host, a Quaker farmer, was speaking with Thomas in the next room. "Riders asking questions about a scarred Negro man and 2 white companions," the farmer was saying. "Said there's a reward of $500. Edwards, Solomon whispered to himself. He rose and joined the conversation. "He survived, then?" Thomas nodded grimly. "And he's following our trail. We need to change our plan." The new plan was dangerous. Solomon would continue north alone, using the Underground Railroad, while the Grimkeys would head east with a decoy portfolio, hopefully drawing pursuers away from Solomon. "The most important thing is that you reach Philadelphia," Thomas told Solomon. "My colleague William Still will help you publish your testimony alongside the evidence." That night, Solomon left the farm with a new guide, a free black man named Jacob, who knew the secret paths north. They traveled through swamps and forests, avoiding roads and settlements, moving only at night. 5 days into their journey, disaster struck. They were crossing a shallow river when shouts and barking dogs announced the arrival of slave catchers. Jacob was shot in the leg as they ran. Solomon helped him to temporary safety in a dense thicket, but the dogs would find them soon enough. "Go!" Jacob insisted, pressing a knife into Solomon's hand. "The papers are what matter. Get them north." Solomon hesitated, then nodded grimly. With the portfolio secured inside his shirt, he continued alone, the sounds of dogs fading behind him. For 3 more weeks, Solomon made his way north. Guided by a series of conductors on the Underground Railroad, he learned to identify safe houses by secret marks, to travel through swamps where dogs lost his scent, to hide in plain sight when necessary. Finally, in early November, he reached Philadelphia. William Still, the black abolitionist Thomas had mentioned, welcomed him into his home. "Thomas sent word of your coming," Still explained, "though we feared you might have been captured when we heard about Jacob. Is he alive but imprisoned? We're working on securing his release." Solomon handed over the portfolio, now water-stained and tattered, but with its contents intact. Still examined the papers with growing excitement. "This is extraordinary evidence," he said. "Names, dates, detailed accounts of experiments performed on human beings, all in their own handwriting." He looked up at Solomon. "But your testimony is equally important. People need to hear from someone who witnessed these horrors firsthand." Over the next several days, Solomon worked with Still and other abolitionists to prepare articles for publication in anti-slavery newspapers. He dictated his experiences in Edward's House of Horrors, describing in clinical detail the experiments he had witnessed and the conspiracy he had uncovered. The first article was published in The Liberator on December 5, 1851, under the headline, "Medical Atrocities, the Secret Experiments of Charleston's Elite upon Enslaved Bodies." The response was immediate and powerful. Additional articles followed in other newspapers. In Philadelphia and other northern cities, crowds gathered to hear Solomon speak. His scarred face became a powerful symbol of the brutality of slavery. In the South, the reaction was predictable. The implicated parties denied everything. Edwards disappeared from Charleston, reportedly fleeing to Europe. Several of his associates committed suicide rather than face the growing scandal. Solomon learned that Thomas and Elizabeth had safely reached Boston, where they continued to advocate for the abolition of slavery. Jacob had been freed through the efforts of Pennsylvania abolitionists and joined Solomon in his speaking tour. But even as Solomon's testimony helped fuel the growing abolition movement, he remained in danger. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, and associates of the men he had exposed all sought to silence him. He survived 2 assassination attempts in his first year of freedom. Despite these dangers, Solomon continued to speak out. His experiences had taught him that silence served only the oppressor. Every audience he addressed, every person who heard his story and was moved to action, represented a small victory in the larger war against slavery. In the spring of 1853, Solomon published a memoir titled The Ugly Slave, My Year in the House of Horrors. The book became an influential text in the abolition movement, its unflinching account of medical experimentation on enslaved people shocking readers on both sides of the Atlantic. On a cold December evening in 1853, as Solomon addressed an audience in a Boston church, a familiar face appeared at the back of the room. Despite the passage of 2 years, Solomon immediately recognized Edwards. Their eyes met briefly before Edwards turned and vanished into the night. Solomon never saw Edwards again, but the encounter haunted him. It was a reminder that the evils he had fought to expose had not been defeated, merely driven underground. The struggle for true freedom would continue long after slavery itself was abolished. Years later, after the Civil War had ended and the 13th Amendment had officially abolished slavery, Solomon returned to Charleston. The city had changed, devastated by war and occupation, but the building that had housed Edwards' bookshop still stood. Solomon approached it cautiously, half expecting to feel the old terror rise within him. Instead, he felt something unexpected: pity. Pity for a man so consumed by his twisted vision of progress that he had lost his humanity. The shop was boarded up, abandoned. Solomon peered through a crack in the shutters at the dusty shelves within. How many had suffered and died in that place? How many stories had ended there so that his might continue? As he turned away from the building, Solomon noticed a group of black children playing nearby. They were thin and poorly dressed, but they were free. They would never know the auction block, never feel the overseer's whip, never be subjected to the kinds of horrors Solomon had witnessed in that bookshop. This was his true victory. Not merely his own freedom, but helping to secure freedom for generations to come. Solomon touched the scar on his face, the mark that had once made him the ugly slave no one wanted. It had become a badge of honor, a symbol of survival against unimaginable cruelty. "You were wrong, Edwards," Solomon whispered to the empty building. "Progress doesn't require sacrifice. It requires justice." With that, Solomon turned his back on the bookshop for the final time and walked into the Charleston sunshine, a free man in a world still learning the true meaning of freedom. 10 years after the end of the Civil War in 1875, Solomon stood before a different audience than he had become accustomed to during his years as an abolitionist speaker. This time, he addressed the United States Congress, testifying about the medical experiments conducted on enslaved people before the war. "Gentlemen," Solomon began, his deep voice carrying through the chamber, "what I speak of today is not merely a historical account of past atrocities. It is a warning about what can happen when science becomes separated from humanity, when progress is pursued at any cost, and when one group of people is deemed expendable for the benefit of another." The congressional investigation had been prompted by disturbing reports that similar experiments were continuing in the South, now targeting the formerly enslaved under the guise of medical care. Solomon's testimony would form part of the historical record, documenting a chapter of American history that many preferred to forget. "The experiments I witnessed and nearly became subject to were not the isolated actions of a madman," Solomon continued. "They were part of a systematic effort, funded by wealthy planters and businessmen, supported by respected doctors and scientists, all seeking to perfect methods of control over those they considered property." As Solomon spoke, he recognized faces in the gallery, abolitionists who had helped him decades earlier, children and relatives of those who had not survived Edwards' experiments, and younger activists continuing the struggle for true equality. After his testimony, Solomon was approached by a young black doctor named Nathan Jenkins, who had been watching from the gallery. "Mr. Wade," Jenkins said, using the surname Solomon had adopted after reaching freedom, "your testimony was powerful, but I believe there is more work to be done." Jenkins explained that he had been collecting evidence of ongoing medical abuses against Black Americans, particularly in Southern hospitals and asylums. He believed that Edwards' research had not died with the end of slavery, but had evolved into new forms of exploitation. "The techniques have changed," Jenkins explained, "but the underlying view remains the same, that black bodies are appropriate subjects for experimentation, that our pain matters less, that our consent is unnecessary." Solomon, now in his 50s, felt a familiar fire rekindling within him. His years of speaking had taken a toll. He had settled in Massachusetts, married, and begun to embrace a quieter life of teaching and writing. But Jenkins' words stirred memories of Sarah, of Jacob, of all those who had sacrificed so that he might live to tell their stories. "What do you propose?" Solomon asked. "A commission," Jenkins replied, "independent of government, composed of doctors, lawyers, and community leaders who can investigate these abuses and bring them to light. Your name, your story, could help legitimize our work." That night, Solomon wrote to his wife Mary, explaining that his return home would be delayed. "There are ghosts that still need putting to rest," he wrote. "The work that began in Edwards' bookshop remains unfinished." Over the next 3 years, Solomon worked with Jenkins and others to document medical abuses against Black Americans. They published their findings in both medical journals and popular newspapers, confronting the medical establishment with evidence of its continuing exploitation. Their work faced fierce opposition. Medical societies denounced them as anti-progress agitators. Politicians accused them of stirring up racial tensions. Several members of their commission received death threats. Their offices in Baltimore were burned to the ground in 1877. Despite these challenges, they persisted. Their investigations led to the closure of several institutions where the worst abuses occurred. Their advocacy helped establish the first medical ethics committees that included black physicians and community representatives. In 1880, Solomon published his second book, From Slavery to Pseudoscience: The Continuing Medical Exploitation of Black Bodies. The book traced connections between the experiments conducted during slavery and contemporary medical practices, arguing that true healing could not occur until the medical profession confronted its history of abuse. The book was controversial but influential, particularly among younger doctors who were beginning to question the ethical frameworks of their profession. Several medical schools added it to their curriculum, using it to spark discussions about medical ethics and racial bias in healthcare. As Solomon entered his 60s, his health began to decline. Years of stress and trauma had taken their toll. He suffered from nightmares, chronic pain, and recurring respiratory infections. Yet he continued to write and speak whenever his strength allowed. In the winter of 1885, Solomon received an unexpected letter. It had been forwarded through various channels, its original sender difficult to trace. The handwriting was shaky, but Solomon recognized it immediately. "Solomon," the letter began without preamble. "I write to you now at the end of my life, not seeking forgiveness which I do not deserve, but offering what small atonement I can in the form of truth." It was signed simply E. Edwards, the man who had purchased Solomon at auction all those years ago, who had planned to use him as a subject in his terrible experiments. The letter continued. "You were right to expose our work. While I once believed in its necessity, I have come to see that no scientific advancement could justify the suffering we inflicted. The notes you took from my safe represented only a fraction of the research conducted. The enclosed documents reveal the full scope of our operations and the names of those who continued the work after my departure from Charleston. Enclosed with the letter were pages of notes, letters, and diagrams, evidence of a medical conspiracy that had continued long after Solomon's escape, evolving and adapting to changing times. Solomon immediately contacted Jenkins, who traveled to Massachusetts to examine the documents. Together, they realized that this new evidence could expose individuals who had risen to prominent positions in medicine, politics, and business in the decades since the war. Publishing this will be dangerous, Jenkins warned. These men have power, influence. Solomon nodded. They had power then, too. It didn't stop us. The publication of Edwards' documents in the spring of 1886 sent shockwaves through American society. Several renowned doctors were implicated in continuing the research that had begun on plantations and in hidden laboratories like Edwards. A Supreme Court justice was forced to resign when his financial backing of these experiments came to light. The backlash was severe. Solomon's home was vandalized. Jenkins lost his position at a prestigious medical school. Newspapers friendly to the implicated parties accused them of fabricating evidence for political gain. But this time, Solomon and Jenkins were not alone. A new generation of activists, journalists, and reformers rallied to their cause. Congressional hearings were held. New legislation was proposed to regulate medical experimentation. In the midst of this renewed battle, Solomon's health took a turn for the worse. In December 1886, he collapsed while giving a lecture at an anti-racism conference in Boston. Doctors diagnosed pneumonia, complicated by his years of stress and trauma. As Solomon lay in his sickbed, visitors came to pay their respects: former abolitionists, young activists, journalists, and doctors inspired by his work. Among them was an elderly Thomas Grimke, who had helped Solomon escape from Charleston 35 years earlier. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't discovered Edwards' laboratory that day?" Grimke asked. Solomon managed a weak smile. "I would have become just another subject in his notebooks. Another experiment terminated at a precise time, with clinical notes about my final moments. Instead, you changed the course of history." Solomon shook his head slightly. "Not me alone. Sarah, who left the map. Jacob, who sacrificed himself so I could continue north. You and Elizabeth, who risked everything to help a fugitive slave. Jenkins, who showed me that the fight wasn't over." He paused, gathering strength. "No one changes history alone." In his final days, Solomon dictated letters to various allies continuing their work, offering encouragement and strategic advice. His last written words were in a letter to a young black woman who had recently become the first female physician at a hospital in Philadelphia. "The path forward is never straight nor easy, but it is illuminated by the light of truth and justice. Walk it boldly." Solomon Wade died on January 17, 1887. His funeral in Boston was attended by hundreds, including Frederick Douglass, who delivered a moving eulogy. "Some men are born to represent the pain of a people, to transform suffering into purpose, to ensure that what was endured in darkness is brought into light, so that it may never happen again." Such a man was Solomon Wade. The commission that Solomon and Jenkins had established continued its work long after Solomon's death. In 1891, it succeeded in lobbying for the passage of the Patient Protection Act, which established some of the first legal protections against non-consensual medical experimentation in the United States. Jenkins, carrying on Solomon's legacy, went on to found the Wade Institute for Medical Ethics, which trained generations of physicians to recognize and resist the dehumanization of marginalized patients. The Institute's motto, taken from Solomon's congressional testimony, read, Science without humanity is not progress, but perversion. In 1951, exactly 100 years after Solomon's escape from Edward's bookshop, the discovery of unethical medical research conducted on black men in Tuskegee, Alabama, brought renewed attention to Solomon's warnings about medical exploitation. Journalists and activists cited his work as prescient, noting how many of the patterns he had identified continued to manifest in American medicine. The struggle that Solomon had been part of, the long fight for black Americans to be treated with full humanity and dignity, continued through the civil rights movement and beyond. His memoir became a foundational text in the study of medical ethics and race, assigned to generations of medical students as a warning about the consequences of separating scientific progress from human rights. Today, Solomon Wade's legacy lives on in ethics committees, in informed consent protocols, in the growing movement for health equity, and in every medical professional who recognizes their responsibility to see the humanity in every patient. His journey from the ugly slave no one wanted to a pivotal figure in American medical ethics represents not just a personal triumph over adversity, but a testament to how one person's moral courage can illuminate injustice and inspire change across generations. The bookshop in Charleston, where Edwards conducted his experiments, no longer stands. In its place is a small memorial garden, established in 2001, with a plaque that reads, "On this site, atrocities were committed in the name of science and progress. We remember those who suffered here and honor those who exposed these crimes against humanity." Their story reminds us that true progress is measured not by what we achieve, but by whom we value. Visitors to the garden often leave small tokens, stones, flowers, handwritten notes beside the statue at its center. The statue depicts not Solomon with his scarred face, as some had proposed, but Sarah, the woman whose secret map and final words had made his escape possible. She stands with one hand extended, pointing north toward freedom, her face turned toward the future she helped create but would never see.